Hi, everyone. So people are still coming in, as is always the case. I'm going to start because it's 12 o'clock. I am Effie McLaughlin. I'm the interim university assistant university dean for research in the Office of Research, the Central Office of Research. And I direct a number of internal funding programs for faculty and also a number of sort of research development efforts and also undergraduate research efforts and basically anything to do with research at CUNY I've handed. But welcome to the February edition of our Funding Fridays webinar series. Today we're going to talk about public and open access mandates from funders. Meg Wacha is our presenter today. You might remember her for those of you that are Funding Friday followers. She also presented in our inaugural Funding Fridays webinar. So, I mean, as Meg and I were discussing, and she's going to get into it, but actually we both think this is a very sort of timely, important topic that maybe not a lot of faculty and staff know about because there are open access requirements from all federal funders. So if you get any federal funding, as you probably know, you have to develop a data management plan, but there's also requirements in terms of how you make your research open access and manage your data. So this is important for everyone that does research, that does funded research. So the monthly, our Funding Friday webinar was launched this past fall by Associate Vice Chancellor Tamara Schneider as a way to provide targeted support during this, as I'm sure you can all appreciate, sort of particularly difficult, isolating, alienating, and uncertain times during the shutdown. So we want to help, support people as they continue in their research and scholarly efforts. This is also a collaboration. It's the first time that we've had sort of an explicit collaboration with the Office of Research, which is me, the Research Foundation Office of Award Pre-Proposal Support, who John Sapogas is the director of and might be on this call. But that is the office within the Research Foundation that does a lot of helps faculty with their particularly, they have a peer review process. So if you're writing a grant proposal, they have a process for helping you get your proposal peer reviewed before you submit it. And they also more generally, help you with if you have any questions about the federal funding process. But the goal of this webinar series is to create a living resource for research development support and information for researchers at all levels, hopefully across the university. These webinars are being recorded and made available on the Office of Research website, and we've got our little compliance slide here. So if you have, this is going to be recorded. It's on YouTube. It's publicly available. So if you are not comfortable having your image on screen, please keep your camera off. And also, please, we are here. We are available to you. So in terms of housekeeping, the presentation, I believe, is going to run about 45 minutes. We are going to make every effort to leave ample time at the end to answer any questions that you have. We're going to let Megan speak, and then if you have any questions at any point during the presentation, type them in the chat, and we will make every effort to go back and answer all of your questions. And I've done this a number of times now. It's actually been fairly successful, not only in getting to people's questions, but also sort of generating a good conversation around these topics. So allow me to briefly introduce Megan Wacha. For those of you that don't know her, she is the Scholarly Communications Librarian in the Office of Library Services. So she actually oversees the development and management of CUNY's open access institutional repository, CUNY Academic Works, which many of you might be familiar with. And she helps do that for the entire university system. So she's here to help you with academic works wherever you are. She also trains faculty and staff about the scholarly publishing landscape, about authors' rights, about open access publishing and alternative publishing trends. And she also serves as the primary resource on copyright compliance, fair use, and other copyright issues for the Office of Library Services. So, I mean, certainly for any of you that are publishing and doing research, she is a very important person for you to know. So Megan, please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Effie. And many thanks to all of you for joining us today. We have this is a big topic. It's an important topic. It's one that I'm excited about. And it's one that if it's new to you, it can take a little bit of time to wrap our head around, right? And so today's webinar is my real aim is to prepare faculty researchers and those that support them to comply with mandates from federal and private funding agencies, addressing topics such as how to make your research openly available regardless of its publication venue or your ability to pay an article processing charge. We will talk about what that is. As well as going into tools to support you as you write and implement a data management plan. I do always think it's helpful to kind of like go back and look a little bit, think about where this is within the history of scholarly publishing. And that history, as we think of it, really starts in the mid-17th century. Empowered by that printing press, scholarly societies gave rise to the first journals by taking information that was once communicated via written letters, printing them, binding them together into journals, so that the research results could be widely disseminated and built upon. And scholarly publishing has largely kept to this tradition. When a new technology, the internet, came about, it offered researchers and scholars a new means of disseminating information. And since its earliest days, it's been used to openly share their work online. So that in the 1990s, a number of research communities established preprint servers. So this is sharing those drafts of your research articles before they've been submitted to a journal for peer review and possible publication. And these preprint servers included Archive in physics, RePEc in economics, SSRN in the social sciences, all of which worked to advance the pace of scientific progress. And this is something that was really brought home for all of us this last year, I think, as we saw this immediate need that we are, grappling with globally in the coronavirus pandemic. We saw researchers respond by sharing their research results early in the process via preprint repositories like bioRxiv and medRxiv, building review processes on top of them so we know that the information that's coming to us is reliable. So really kind of responding in real time. And so with the internet, right, scholars also began to establish some of the first fully open access journals to support a new model of freely accessing research content while still working within the traditions of peer review. In contrast, commercial publishers harness the internet to shift from a model in which journal content is purchased and held by libraries, allowing us to lend it to others freely, to a model in which the content is licensed. So like getting the latest movie on Netflix. And despite the lower distribution costs for publishers, so no stamps to buy, less paper to print, we really saw a dramatic rise in the price of journal subscriptions, one that drastically outmatched inflation and our libraries' budgets. And publishers' profit margins have continued to rise. In fact, they often outpace those of companies like Starbucks, Apple, Disney, and Google. I realize this chart is a little bit out of date. I'm noticing it's blurry. I apologize for that. But this has really only continued to grow. So Elsevier's profit margin now hovers around 37% of pure profit. And these profits are supported by a system in which researchers and their peers write the work, review the work, and edit the journals that publish the work, all for free. Yet when you want to read a work or you want your work to be read, we're too often locked out by a paywall, being asked to pay $30, $40, $200 for an article that we've only read the abstract. We don't even know if it's what we need yet. And so in response, we have open access, a model in which anyone with an internet connection can read research for free without legal, technical, or financial barriers. There have been some common myths that have followed open access around for some time now, including that open access content is low quality content. And yes, some open access content, like some paywalled content, can be low quality. But some OA journals are actually amongst the most prestigious in their disciplines. This is about a distribution model, not about the quality of the work. There's also been a myth, a misconception really, that authors must pay for open access. And while the commercial industry typically does charge a fee, again, we'll talk about that in a bit, 70% of open access journals put out by the scholarly community do not charge any fees to their authors. And an open access journal isn't the only path to open access. You can also publish in any journal of your choosing, including paywalled journals, and then self-archive that work in an open access repository. So when I first joined CUNY, because I know copyright is often a question around this, I conducted an analysis of the sharing policies of the journals that CUNY faculty are already working with, right? That's the most important thing, is supporting you to publish in the journal you want to publish in. And while it depends on the discipline and the school, between 85 and 95% of the journals CUNY faculty are working with already allow them to share their work in some form. Now, it might not be that beautiful publisher's PDF. In most cases, it's the author's manuscript, the final peer-reviewed and edited version, but without the publisher's formatting, typically a Word doc. But that's content that can be shared. And it's content that can benefit you, your work, and the wider public. Because by making a work openly available, it is shared with those that can't access it, including your colleagues at other institutions. This can lead to further collaboration and opportunities. It provides increased visibility via search engines, and when a work is read more, it's cited more. More researchers can build upon your work on a faster timeline. It returns scholarly publishing to its original purpose, which is, again, to disseminate work so that it can be read and built upon, not to create an information divide between those that can pay and those that cannot. So I have a really select, very select timeline of open access, right? And we see in the 1990s, like with the launch of the internet, we have the launch of the first preprint repository, right? As soon as we're online, scholars are too. And then over the next decade, the legal and technical and organizational infrastructure starts to get set up to support a larger, more coordinated approach. So that as soon as the early aughts, federal funding agencies like NIH, like the NSF, are recommending open access and then requiring it. That research produced by public tax dollars should be made accessible to the public. Right? This seems very much in line with CUNY's mission as well. And so in 2013, the work of the NSF and the NIH extended to all federal agencies. Under the Obama administration, the Office of Science and Technology Policy released a memo, one that mandated that all federal agencies with more than 100 million in R&D expenditures develop plans to make the published results of federally funded research freely available to the public within 1 year of publication, and further requiring researchers to better account for and manage the digital data resulting from federally funded scientific research. It's important to note that this is a bipartisan issue, one that was carried forward by the administration succeeding Obama, and one which the Biden administration has already recognized as central to the success of its public health initiatives. So Biden has elevated the science advisor's role to a cabinet level position. And within his first week on the job, he signed an executive order that built upon the OSTP memo to create a new interagency task force to review scientific integrity policies across the federal government. And so we're expecting to see a lot of growth in this area and changes to the requirements. But for now, this is a list of the federal agencies, many of whom support research at CUNY, that have established plans. So more agencies require it, but these ones have established plans to require investigators to make the products of their research, whether that's articles or data, publicly available online within 12 months of publication. We are anticipating that under the current administration, that embargo period of 12 months is going to be removed. So it must be made available immediately upon a publication. But we'll keep you posted. And we're also seeing private funders develop these policies as well. So from Sloan to Hewlett to the MacArthur Foundation, funders want the work that they fund to be as widely disseminated as possible, right? They want as much impact for what they're supporting with their finances. They want it to have the greatest impact possible. And they do that through open and public access. I will say, in addition to these funders, this is a little bit separate from, but related to, in addition to these funders, a group of private and national funders in the EU have even formed a coalition called Plan S. with shared OA mandates, so they all have the same mandate, that is currently pressuring publishers, all publishers, to flip to a fully open access publishing model in the next 5 to 6 years. One in which instead of libraries subscribing to paywalled resources, they will establish memberships with these players, serving as a pipeline to publication. We don't know yet if that will be successful or not. I actually have some concerns about that model. That's a whole other conversation we can have over coffee sometime. But the key thing here is that whether we are talking about federal agencies, private funders based here in the US, or the EU, who we may be collaborating with or funding our work directly, or funders elsewhere, it can be difficult to parse out what the requirements are and how to meet them. Right? So if we just take a look at this small group of private funders, all of them require grantees to share the results of their published research, whether that's immediately upon publication or accommodating a brief embargo. So there's even some differences in between them. Almost all of them require grantees to share the data that research is based upon. Now, unlike federal agencies, they don't require like that 2-page data management plan. But instead, this requirement is embedded into the language of the proposal guidance. So the Sloan Foundation, for instance, asks, how will your data and code be shared, annotated, cited, or archived? What else will you do to make your findings reproducible by other researchers, right? And so the grants officers really want to know that you're considering this as you are applying for these funds. Some are even less specific. The Ford Foundation requires an open Creative Commons license for all grant-funded work, and that applies to data, but it's not as clearly specified. And the Ford Foundation is just one of 3 funders that do this from this list, right? That require that Creative Commons license. So we see that there are many different configurations of requirements, and of course, there are many different ways to meet them. This, of course, is not and can't be your primary focus as you conduct your research, right? This is a lot of headspace to take up. So what does this mean for you on a practical level? There are, of course, many benefits to openly sharing your research, but when it's required, it becomes a matter of compliance. And so this is why campus grants officers ask faculty researchers to acknowledge in writing their responsibilities to comply with these mandates. Some of you may have seen some forms that are this or look like this, right? It might be a campus specific form or one of the templates developed by the Research Foundation shown here. And so in the time that we have left, what I'm going to do is go through some practical tools and tips you can use as your work moves through the research lifecycle, so you can meet these requirements with as little pain as possible. From the data management plan to sharing those articles. Increasingly, funders require that grant proposals include a supplementary document called a data management plan, or a DMP, that describes the data that will be generated by a project, how it will be handled throughout the research data lifecycle, and how it will be preserved and shared at the end of the project, right? So this is essentially a document that will be a part of your application for funding, and then you are charged with implementing it at each stage of your research process. DMPs generally advance FAIR data principles. So that's an acronym for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. FAIR data, we'll hear that a lot. And these principles make research reproducible and efficient and increase the impact of your data over time. Right? So a recent study showed that 80% of the research data produced in the 90s is lost. It's just gone. But where could we be in terms of scientific progress if that research was findable and accessible, if we could build upon it, being sure to provide attribution back to the person who originally collected it? And so that's the aim now, to improve access and use now and in the future. And this applies to many different types of data. I apologize, I'm going to read directly the definition by the Code of Federal Regulations, which defines research data as, quote, the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as necessary to validate research findings, end quote. It can include lab notebooks, audio interviews and transcripts, photographs, database content, gene sequences. So there's really a full range, and data isn't just limited to the sciences. This extends into the humanities as well. So with the caveat that I know enough about data management to know that I am not a specialist in this area. There are specialized research data management librarians. Let's talk a little bit about the components of the DMP. Many funders have created their own DMP template, which generally asks researchers to address the topics listed here. And there are some questions you can ask yourself throughout to support the process. And I'm pulling from, there's a lot of really great resources that have been crowdsourced in support of this. And so I am pulling from one of those, being the Digital Curation Center checklist, which is in wide use. Data collection includes a description of the types and estimated amount of data that will result from your research, where it will be preserved and shared, and the rationale for these decisions. What data will you collect or create? How will the data be collected or created? What metadata standards will you use to describe the data, right? So metadata is usually described as data about data. And there are standards for being consistent for the way that that's done. You could use Dublin Core, which is very user-friendly and in wide adoption. There's also a standard that's specific for data, the Data Documentation Initiative. You'll want to ask, what information will someone, including yourself, need to read, interpret the data in the future? So I suspect, I don't know how many people we have. We have 60 people on the call right now. I suspect I am not alone in this call about having that experience of opening a file, assuming that you know what software you need to open a file, right? That's a piece of metadata that you're going to need, of opening a file and not quite remembering how the data included in it or the content included in it was created or what a particular field means, right? And so it's important to track that as you're creating it. You'll want to think about issues in terms of how will you manage ethical issues, such as the privacy of participants. Do things need to be anonymized? Is there data that can't be shared or that sharing should be postponed? What license will you attach to the data to both permit reuse, but alongside that reuse, ensure that the attribution goes back to you? So there's sometimes a misconception that data doesn't apply for copyright. And it's true that you can't copyright facts, but there is a lot of intellectual work that comes into the collection of data. And so it's important to place it under a license so that it can be freely used and built upon, right? Where will the data be physically located and how often will it be backed up? For instance, it might start on servers in 2 different buildings and backed up once a week. Who's going to run those backups? How will content be recovered if it's lost? Are there any security protocols that will be in place? I won't say who, but I've once read a DMP, so this is a real life DMP, that said the data would be backed up on a hard drive and kept in a locked file cabinet. Backup and security. I really hope that file cabinet wasn't under a leaky radiator. You know, and while I understand where this is coming from, and in many ways that's better than doing nothing, it's not necessarily going to be looked favorably upon, right? You typically want to have 3 copies in geographically distributed locations, right? Making sure that natural disasters, leaky radiators, and hungry pets, you know, won't lead to loss. And it's important to demonstrate this to grants officers as they're reviewing your application, that you're committed to the integrity of your data and its future use through being thoughtful about how that data is stored and made accessible in line with established standards. In terms of selection and preservation, how long do you plan to retain the data and how will it be preserved? Will it be in a repository? Which one? Depending on the size of your data, have you factored in possible costs associated with its storage, right? If you have a lot of data, there are going to be costs to that. And those are costs that you can build into your budget. How will you share the data and with whom? Will you get a persistent identifier for the data so that it can easily be found and cited? And this is something that many repositories can provide, is to provide you with a DOI or a digital object identifier. And increasingly, even if your work isn't funded, we're seeing a lot of journals now requiring that the data that a research article is built upon is made accessible, and you have to cite that in your article itself. So a DOI can be very helpful for that. You know, in terms of sharing and access, I will say again, right, like I've seen a number of DMPs that state if someone wants the data, they can email me, right? Or they can email my assistant. But then, you know, how will someone know that you have the data? What happens if you're not there to answer the email, right? Like we all retire or otherwise move on at some point, right? And while that additional barrier might be necessary for some protected data, it doesn't quite work as a standard approach for all data across the board, right? So really thinking about other ways that we can share that maybe we haven't adopted in our work before now. You know, and finally, who is going to be responsible for doing this work, right? And what resources are going to be required to deliver the plan? One of the best ways that you can support your future self is to anticipate the resources that you're going to need and embed that again into your budget and into your plan so that you can be successful in accomplishing this. Now, I promised some tools. There are many different tools to help you as you manage your data and as you plan to manage it. CUNY Libraries has a guide based on a lot of different guides that are out there in higher ed, a lot of different people that do these things to get you started. It goes over different things to consider in terms of your data and the collection of it, the description of it, formatting and organization, all of those key components. And it links out to different resources to support you in that process, including a variety of different repositories that you might work with. Specific to this guide as well is that it includes a page about grant requirements and data management plans. Again, a lot of this has been crowdsourced by the community. So we have links to templates, example plans from funded projects. If you want to see what like a successful DMP looks like, every DMP is going to look different because every person's data does. And one of my favorite tools, which is the data management plan tool, the DMP tool. DMP tool was originally a grassroots effort from 8 institutions, including the University of California and the University of Virginia, right? So this comes straight out of higher ed. And it is a free and open source application that helps researchers create data management plans. To create an account, you simply sign in at the top of the page. If you are creating the account for the first time, right, you have the option of affiliating your DMP with CUNY. So I would just select this button that reads your institution and begin typing, selecting my institution from the list. At that point, you enter some basic information about yourself, first name, last name, and your CUNY email. I'm going to go ahead and create the account. And then immediately, first button is create plan. Now, while there's basic elements that are common across all data management plans, each funder has a slightly different template, so you can select from the list. So you just simply start typing and they will automatically appear. In this case, I'm going to select one for the National Endowment for the Humanities. You can enter project details, so an abstract around it, the project start and end date. This is all information, you know, this is metadata, right? That's going to be useful to you in the future. You can read a plan overview. So what are the different elements that you're going to have to pull together? This is stuff that can be, you know, emailed to your collaborators and be like, heads up, this is what we're going to have to do. And then you can actually go in and start writing the plan within DMP tool itself, getting some guidance from the right-hand side. And if you want to make a comment to any of your collaborators that are helping you write this, because yes, you can add collaborators, you can toggle over and select the tab and just begin typing in the box. To add a collaborator, you can simply select the tab at the top, share. Add the emails for your peers, setting their permission levels to co-owner, editor, or read only. And they will receive a ping and be able to sign in and view and contribute to this plan, provided they have permissions. And once you've finalized your DMP and downloaded it for submission to the funder, I really want to stress that it's important to think about it as, that's not where things end, right? A DMP is a living, working document that describes the entire project. Whether it's a funded project or not, it's helpful to have a DMP. And it's a document that is frequently referred to and updated as a result, right? Things change. And so your DMP will too. So we've covered DMPs. And in addition to sharing your data, funders often require that the research products, so in this case, it's largely research articles that are built upon that data, are openly shared online. Now, but at the time of submitting your grant, you have a hypothesis, perhaps, but you don't know your research findings or where they will be accepted and published, being a key point, right? Because that journal is going to determine your ability to share. There are a range of venues that you might choose, and this includes open access journals that may or may not charge a fee. What are referred to as hybrid journals, so they're part open access, part paywalled. They are paywalled by default, but if you pay a fee, they will permit authors to share, typically under a Creative Commons license. And whether you are publishing in a hybrid journal and don't want to or can't pay a fee, or you're publishing in a fully paywalled journal, you may still be able to share the work openly via an open access repository. So how do we do these things? Well, it's important to plan for multiple paths, asking yourself a few questions. Does the funder require a license or publication in an open access journal? If yes to either of these questions, you might want to build, again, that cost into your grant. It can also be helpful to check the journal's sharing policies and read your contract. I am happy to read your contract with you. Does it permit deposit in a repository? Does the journal require an embargo so that, you can share it in a repository, but you have to wait 12 months until after it was published? Does the funder permit that type of embargo? The funders are really, in many cases, the funders and the scholars asking for it are determining what the journals are willing to do. So it's important to engage in these conversations. If you anticipate a publication fee, build that cost into the grant. It can range widely. Nature is starting to consider article processing charges, APCs, these fees, and they're putting a price tag of $12,000 on it. But typically we see them between $200,000 and $5,000. But it's really important that you also know that you, and this is true again, whether it's funded research or not, you can negotiate for your rights as an author. Myself and a number of the names I saw on the participants lists, my colleagues in the libraries, have entire workshops that are devoted to this negotiation process. For our purposes, I will say that it doesn't have to be difficult, and it really isn't. They may already permit you to share the work, that accepted manuscript, in a repository. But if you do need to negotiate for more, you don't need to be a lawyer. You don't need to be fluent in legalese, but use plain language and just tell them what you need. This research is funded by this entity and is subject to its, policy. I need permission to share it via a repository and, to share it within 6 months of publication, right? It can be as simple as that. Because it's really key, because at this time that you're asked to sign a copyright transfer agreement or another type of author agreement, it's easy to click the button, be so happy they want to publish you and go on and share. I've done this myself before, but we risk sharing or giving away the rights that we need in order to comply with these mandates, right? So read it, tell them what you need. Even if it's a click through, tell them to revise that contract. And you are in a good negotiating position. At that point, No journal has ever turned away an author because they wanted more content. You are in a good negotiating position. They've invested a lot in you and they have a deadline that they want to meet to publish. So that is the time to have this conversation. If you want support in this process, myself and my colleagues throughout CUNY libraries are here to help. We have someone at each campus, so just ask. Whether a funder requires it or not, repositories preserve content for the future and provide enhanced access to it in the present. They offer a huge benefit to you and your work. There was a study, it depends on your discipline, it depends on the quality of the work, but sharing your work openly in an open access repository can increase your citation rate from 200 to 600%, right? When we say there is benefit to your work, there is benefit to your work. Now, the funder may designate a repository like PubMed Central, and you have to submit there. If both a funder specified repository and an institutional repository exist and can take your work, then consider depositing in both locations, because sharing it in more locations means more readers will find it and ultimately cite and use that work. And I will say, like, the range of people that pull content is exceptional. Here at CUNY, we have CUNY Academic Works, our institutional repository that comes out of a UFS statement and resolution that shows CUNY's commitment to open access. And we collect and share research and other pedagogical works from across the university freely online. And we hear from people every day, from researchers, from students, from practitioners, doctors, nurses that are reading the research that's produced by CUNY and integrating it into their work and in their lives. Now, with CUNY Academic Works, we have no mandate. Submission is entirely optional. All you need is the time to do it. And it's a powerful tool that can serve as a site to share your research products, including your data. We accept data when it is required, and also when you just want to. So to submit to the repository, you just go to the URL, academicworks.cuny.edu, and I've put it at the bottom of the page. You select My Account to begin creating one if you don't already have one. I apologize, yes, this does mean creating another login. You navigate to the appropriate series. So there is a series for each CUNY campus devoted to their publications and research. If you have multiple affiliations, don't worry, that's fine. We will make sure it finds its way to each of those spaces. Just submit it to one. You can select Submit Work from the left-hand navigation. I've highlighted things here with some boxes. Sign the submission agreement that essentially says you are the copyright holder or you have permission of the copyright holder to share the work, and giving CUNY the right to distribute it via the repository. If CUNY wants to do anything else with it, I don't know what that would be, but if CUNY wants to do anything else with it, they have to come back and ask for your permission. We then ask you to provide some basic metadata describing yourself and the work. This takes maybe 5 minutes. I see some faculty that I think are home on Friday night, perhaps watching some bad television, and just upload all of their works from their CV. You know, after you've added the metadata, we do need you to upload the file of your article, spreadsheet, or whatever format it may be in. This is about providing access to the works. So just the citation, you know, we unfortunately can't approve for posting. If you're uploading data, you can select this option below, additional files, and add your code book there, right? So that the data and, you know, the book that describes how you collected and, you know, folks can use that data are all held together. And then there's a quick review process by a librarian. We make sure all that metadata is in place, so you don't need to worry if you've made a mistake or a typo. And it goes live to the public here in our city and worldwide, wherever people look for information online. So that could be CUNY Libraries OneSearch or your favorite search engine. Unlike a personal website, Academic Works really works beautifully with these search engine algorithms, including Google and Google Scholar. And in fact, 80% of the users that come to us come to the PDF or the file directly from Google and Google Scholar. They never even see this page. So this has led to CUNY content being downloaded almost 2 million times each year. by users in every state and every country. I'm always really excited to see Greenland there. Truly demonstrating the power of open access for you, for your work, and yes, for the funders too, right? So we only expect to see this grow, and the libraries and grants officers and RF elsewhere are here to support you in that process. And so with that, I will share my email and we can move to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Meg. I always learn. I've seen you speak any number of times, and I always learn something new every single time. So we have a few questions in the chat right now, but I encourage all of you to type in any questions you have, or if things occur to you as we have this conversation, please do that. So the first question is encryption of data acceptable if there is a protocol for vetted parties to access the data?
So again, I will just give the little caveat that I am not a research data management specialist. And this is when it starts to show. My understanding is that yes, encryption of data is acceptable and that some data just cannot be shared for various reasons or does require a vetting process. But those are all things that can be detailed in your data management plan to show the funders that you have thought about this and your reasoning why, right? So if you can't share the data, here is why.
Mm-hmm. And I actually asked, I mean, as a complete novice in this space, and again, I recognize you're not a data management librarian, but how does cloud storage, I mean, a lot of people just upload their data into one cloud or another. Do you know how that impacts sort of the security question? And do you know, does that make sense?
So cloud services can be really helpful, right? Because cloud services ultimately align with physical locations. So one thing that I pay attention to if I'm uploading to Amazon Web Services, for instance, is that you can designate where you want the servers to be located. Oh. Right? And so you can consider that geographic distribution. Oh. If you have something on the West Coast, do you have something up in Canada and, in an old mine, right? Like where do you want those servers to be located? Because natural disasters really can knock out a lot of data. There are definitely potentially some security issues. So the guide that is available through CUNY libraries, and I can put a link to that in the chat, does kind of point to some of CUNY's policies around it. And there are also recommendations for specific repositories that you can use for your data. There are data-specific repositories, and there are data-specific repositories that are also specific to disciplines. And so there's a whole range. There's a repository that describes the repositories. And so you have choices about where those go, and a repository is going to will help address some of those security issues because they are stewarded by information professionals, right?
Okay. My friend Adam Greenberg from the ASRC wants to make sure that the ASRC is as an option on CUNY Academic Works in terms of where your affiliation is, because you said that there's pages for each one of the colleges. Is the ASRC on
Yes, there? The ASRC has, I think I know where Adam's question, it's potentially gets a little bit into the weeds. Folks at the ASRC can submit to the link that I've just put in there. I have it there in my memory. The affiliation, there's some complicated elements pulling from metadata standards, actually, where we were pulling from a list in CUNY first. So that's something we're hoping to address moving forward. So thank you, Adam.
Jill provided some stats about the how many works there are in CUNY Academic Works and how many times they've been downloaded, about 5 bajillion times. I don't know if you all can see that in the chat, but it's very impressive. So there's Alan Lyons has the question about is the data uploaded assigned a DOI? I'm assuming he's meaning to Academic Works.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the short answer is no. The longer answer is not yet. CUNY Academic Works launched in one software platform, and we do hope to grow and expand, both in terms of the platform and the services that are associated with it, because we recognize DOI minting as central to it. There are a number of repositories, however, though, that do mint DOIs upon submission, and that's something that they will make very clear in their description, and that you can consider as you're choosing where to include your work. I will say again, just as geographic distribution is very useful, so is distribution across repositories. So just because you've submit to one repository doesn't mean that you can't submit to another. Lots of copies keep things safe, or lots of copies keep stuff safe is one of the acronyms we like to go with.
We had a question just in, are there blockchain-based OA repositories?
I feel like I want to pull from the, I want to crowdsource the response to this one. I am not familiar with a blockchain-based OA repository. However, I would be surprised if there isn't one. But I myself am not familiar with one. Repositories really, we think about them as software platforms, but they come with a legal, a technical, and a social infrastructure, right? So some repositories are going to require certain types of licensing, or might have some things hidden in the terms of use. At CUNY Academic Works, we have that submission agreement in plain language right there every time you make a submission, right? We really want to be faculty friendly. They have different technical components and services, and also different social structures around them, right? CUNY Academic Works will, foreseeably exist as long as CUNY Libraries does. But, who knows where we're all going to be 500 years from now. So we preserve things for as long as possible. And this, again, because of degradation that does happen to social, legal, and technical infrastructures, it can be helpful to submit to a couple of different places.
So this next question is great. This goes back to what you were talking about compliance. And I was actually just looking at the attendees to see if there was anyone from our compliance division on the call, and I don't think there is. But the question is, what would be a good strategy for explaining data sharing while applying for the IRB? I'm concerned that I wouldn't get IRB approval if I plan on sharing my data. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question. Human subject privacy is absolutely central to the work that a lot of folks do. And it's one of the things that we consider, for instance, when we're bringing student work into the repository. Has this received the proper IRB approvals? I think in my experience, it is a matter of how you are going to protect the data, right? How things can be anonymized, and, or otherwise that privacy can be protected. It is also the case that not all data can be shared. So I really leave that to you as a specialist and as the researcher to know, when that is and isn't appropriate. It's just a matter of, providing a justification when you are submitting those funding applications.
Yeah, and I could also, this would be a good conversation for, the Office of Library Services and the Office of Research, the Compliance Unit, to sort of have a conversation about too. That's so we can continue this conversation. So Alan Lyons had said, any thoughts about the Mendeley repository? They assign a DOI, but I wonder how long this private company will be willing to support it. Are you familiar with the Mendeley repository?
So Mendeley, my understanding, at least its origins, are as a citation manager. I'm not familiar with its DOI minting. Perhaps one of my colleagues is. Mendeley is owned by the company Elsevier. Elsevier is no longer a publisher, but they continue to publish, but they are no longer a publisher. They have rebranded as an information analytics company. So their business model is now based upon the data that they collect about researchers and about the people who read their work. In the library world, we have some concerns about that in terms of privacy. especially as we're seeing they increasingly signing contracts with government entities like ICE, being used to build those systems. So with Mendeley, I think there are some values questions and ethics questions related to the use. I would typically use an open source tool that comes out of the academic community called Zotero, which can provide a lot of the same services in terms as a reference manager for you. Okay.
So we had a question actually as a ResearchGate user. This is interesting. Can you please say a few words about ResearchGate? Is there anything to be concerned with uploading there? That's a very sort of common scholarly, place where people share their research.
Yeah, ResearchGate's history is super interesting. It comes out of it was originally funded by the Gates Foundation. Now I think they were recently acquired by Wiley. I could be wrong about that. They're also largely based in information analytics. So I think the primary utility of that is being able to share the work with fellow researchers. Both with ResearchGate and academia.edu, you typically need to create an account and sign in order to download the work. So it's not like open access, you have to pay with your data. And here it's the personal data, not your research data. I think there are some questions around the long-term access, right? Because it's about immediate access, not about preservation and future use.
Can you remind us if the repositories that CUNY might suggest have been vetted in terms of security? Also, are certain disciplines recommended to share in other repositories?
I missed the last bit of that question. I'm seeing a lot more questions coming by. And thank you to Jill for weighing in on some of them.
I guess it's first, okay, can you remind us if the repositories that CUNY might suggest have been vetted in terms of security? So that's in terms of the security of the different repositories, and then also if there's recommendations based on discipline, like do some disciplines share in some repositories more than others?
Yes. Right. So in terms of security, right, it's about, is it an entirely open access repository, or do they allow for some private content, right? Because that's going to yield different things. For CUNY academic works, we haven't had a hacker come in and try to get at everything, but we wouldn't need to, because nothing comes into the repository that can't be openly shared. It is put into the repository for that purpose. Other repositories, because they are discipline specific, may allow for different types of use. So may allow data to be held privately or held privately for a period of time, and would address these security issues. So I think that's really the key thing, right? Different disciplines are producing different data. And so it can be very helpful to find one that is unique to your discipline and uses. They are out there, and they're available. You can search for them. There's that repository of repositories that I mentioned, Reshare, and I will pop that into the chat. And it's on the guide as well, is a good place to go and find something that's unique to your discipline and to read more a little bit about what it does and doesn't do. Typically, there is always someone that you can ask a question. If you can't find contact at a repository, there are questions about how useful it will be for you. So it's helpful to look.
So there's sort of some comments in here. Patrick Slattery shared an article about blockchain.
Great.
Oh, and yes, I do want to say before we sign, I mean, we still have a few minutes if people have more questions, but all of this, we make all the PowerPoint presentation, as well as this video of this webinar, will be available on our website. I also email you when that's available. And also Megan and I are all available for any questions at any time. So, I mean, you'll certainly, if you have think of anything after this, we will be available to you. So Jill had a comment on her take on Mendeley. So Jill is actually, she's a librarian at the Graduate Center, and she's also participating in this call. And she had some suggestions. I will also save, one of the things that we can do on Zoom is I can save the comments. So I could also post the comments because there's some helpful links for resources in here, including
all of those
reshare.
are on the guide as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It looks like that's mostly it in terms of questions. Does anyone else have any questions before we sign off? Because I usually I try to keep these, I try to throw a wall, to make these as within the hour as much as possible, because I know that all of your time is valuable and it's a Friday and we all have Zoom fatigue. So if there's no more questions, as I said, you can email me anytime, visit the Office of Research website anytime, and thank you so much for participating. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks
you,
everyone
Effie.
for coming. See you all soon. See you next month.